affirm that the evidence you give will be the truth? Do you affirm that the evidence you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, will you say, I do?
I do, sir.
Thanks for coming, Mr. Lackay. You were employed by SARS for a period of 11 years, and you resigned in February 2015. You served out until March 1915. What was your position within SARS?
That is correct. Firstly, good afternoon, Judge and your panel and Advocate Steinberg. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you, and hopefully I can assist in some way with the work that you are tasked. I was a spokesperson for SARS, resigning on the dates that you alluded to, 19 February, and my last day of employment at SARS was 19 March 2015. Thank you.
So you were the spokesperson?
That is correct.
We're in possession of a letter that you wrote to the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Finance and the chairperson of the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence. It's dated 24th March 2015. And so you wrote that letter really a few days after you left your office at SARS.
That is correct.
It's a useful letter for our purposes because it's really quite extensively summarizes why you resigned. And, well, really in your words, the reason for the letter, which you say at paragraph 2, you say you have reason to believe that the Commissioner of SARS, Mr. Tom Moyane, will be addressing these two standing committees in the coming days on the events that have recently occurred, and you want to put your version of the facts before these committees, which you say is a true version of the events, and you want to apprise them of what you say is the heart of the ongoing matters at SARS. And this is the letter where you capture that. Now, we have the letter, we'll look at it in some depth. I really just want to ask you to elaborate on certain aspects. You start by saying that during the latter part of 2014, you say, I was caused by the Commissioner to issue statements to media, and it became apparent to me at a later stage that such public statements contained false and incorrect information. Can you elaborate on that?
Thank you. I can recall at least 3 instances for the period October, November, and December 2014, where I had either to answer to media inquiries that SARS would receive, or I had to draft and issue a media statement on behalf of SARS. It started with the systematic withholding of information from me. And I contend it made it impossible for me to do my work effectively, and my working conditions became intolerable. Things were happening in the institution that found its way into the media and into the public space. I am the person to whom journalists come seeking clarity, seeking confirmation or denials, or seeking basic information about what was happening. And in those conditions, in 3 instances that I can recall, I had to construct a public comment, issue it to a media institution. It was subsequently published, and because information was being withheld from me, by Mr. Moyane in particular, I effectively issued wrong or incorrect statements to the media. I can explain the first 2 instances if you want. The third instance I remember very clearly. It was on the 3rd of December 2014. I was called into the Commissioner's boardroom. I was briefed by him and the head of HR at the time. And this concerned the resignation of Mr. Barry Hoare as Chief Operating Officer. My apologies, it's not the 3rd of December, it's the 2nd of December 2014. SARS then issues a statement announcing the resignation. I was instructed to write it in a particular way, and it was approved by SARS. And basically, we say to the media, Mr. Hoare has a distinguished career. He's done wonderful work at SARS, and he has displayed instrumental leadership. And then the Commissioner is quoted. He thanks Mr. Hoare for his selfless commitment and diligence to SARS and for his leadership as a member of the SARS management team, unquote. My issue with this statement was that it became apparent to me later, to me and other people in the institution, that despite telling the world that what a wonderful employee Mr. Hoare was, that they are leaving on good terms, parting ways, SARS was in effect working very hard to bring some kind of disciplinary proceedings against Mr. Hoare. I believe it was in the form of a grievance from a subordinate. I don't know if Mr. Hoare testified to that in appearing before you. But it clearly contradicted the image we tried to portray of the second most senior executive leaving and that everything was well. Everything was clearly not well.
Mr. Hoare did testify. He told us that after he'd resigned, SARS continued to pursue the matter, the grievance that was against him.
That is correct. And for me, it was puzzling at best, probably irrational at worst. Someone gives notice that is resigning. As the employer, you accept the resignation and you instruct the employee you must serve your month's notice period. And in that last period, you still want to actively push a process where you want to bring charges of some kind against the employee. That to me was a very early sign of the vindictiveness by the new SARS management against some of its most senior employees. And it was very concerning. And like other former colleagues who testified here before now, it was an indication of the climate of fear that was starting to develop within the institution.
Judge, I should have pointed out that there are two reasons I asked Mr. Lackay this question. The one is that it goes to why he resigned ultimately. But the other is that one of our other terms of reference is whether any media statement issued by SARS or similar statement in any way brought SARS into disrepute. And I think this testimony might be relevant to that too.
Well, if you're going to expand to that, that's fine. I mean, we'll have to hear it at some stage. If it's convenient to hear it now, well, we might as well hear it now. Yes.
Are there other... Sorry, please go ahead. We're happy. Are there other examples you'd like to give us in that regard?
Yes, I would, if I may check my records.
Can I just ask one question, if you don't mind, before? To whom did you report at the time before Mr. Miyani was appointed? Where was your reporting line?
As spokesperson, I always reported to the SARS Commissioner. My office was on the same floor as that of the SARS Commissioner, specifically for that purpose. And then for daily administrative purposes, we would report to the company secretary.
In formulating communications to the outside world, etc.
That was
to
all
the SARS Commissioner.
SARS Commissioner, sir.
And then post Mr. Miyani coming?
That was part of the complications for me. That relationship started to break down to the extent that there was no regular interactions anymore. And this was at a time when the institution was in the headlines week after week, as I'm sure you know for that period, the last quarter of 2014 and the first quarter of 2015.
So you were going to give us other instances where you felt you were compromised in what you told the media.
Yes, thank you. I can refer to the media statement issued on 5 December 2014. That was a media statement drafted and created without me having sight of it before it was released. It was issued in the name of the SARS Commissioner, Mr. Tom Moyane. It was a statement to announce the resignation, or the suspension rather, of Mr. Ivan Pillay and Mr. Pete Richer. And the statement clearly uses as a basis for these suspensions the Sikakane report and its findings. If I will be allowed to quote from it, the commissioner said he sought legal advice on how to deal with Sikakane's findings. Based on the findings and recommendations as set out below, in other words by Sikakane, I have therefore decided to suspend the following 2 senior executives pending a disciplinary process, and the executives are listed as Mr. Ivan Pillay, Deputy Commissioner, Mr. Pete Richer, Group Executive, Strategic Planning and Risk. Then it delves into the findings of the Sikakane panel and so on. As I've said, I had no input, sight, or knowledge of this statement. It was issued, and that's the first time I saw it. Now, going back to the earlier testimony of Mr. Pillay and the Labour Court proceedings, about 2 weeks after the statement is issued, the Labour Court finds Sikakane made no adverse findings against Mr. Pillay, or any other third party for that matter. Yet, when this thing is issued beginning December to the media, Sikakane is held as the reason why these people must be suspended, and suspended immediately. So, this is clearly a distortion of fact if measured against Judge Person's judgment in the Labour Court of 18 or 19 December. And things like this made me very uncomfortable on the one hand in doing the work I was required to do, and very uncertain about my own role and future within SARS. I can continue with 2 other examples, being mindful of time, Advocate. 4th February 2015. By this time, my duties as a spokesperson had been substantially diluted. I was told you will no longer speak on certain matters to the media on behalf of SARS. Other people will, specifically Mr. Luther Lebilo, who was a HR, he was an executive for employee relations in human resources at the time.
Which were the matters that you weren't allowed to speak about?
I wasn't. The explanation given to me was, Adrian, you cannot speak about employee issues to the media anymore. Effectively, it meant that any inquiry about these rogue unit allegations cannot be answered by me anymore. And then I was also told I would report to someone else, but that's another matter. 4 February 2015, Mr. Johan van Logrenberg resigns. We are then instructed, you will issue the statement. If I may quote from it, it says, Van Logrenberg resigned, and SARS hereby confirms that the parting of ways was amicable and agreed to be in the best interest of SARS. And then SARS wishes Mr. Van Logrenberg all the best in his future endeavors. SARS considers the matter fully and finally dealt with. This is for February 2015. To my knowledge, from this day to 15 May 2015, when case number 427/05/15 was opened by SARS, with Tom Moyane being the complainant, SARS had never fully and finally closed the matters against Van Logrenberg. This is a blatant lie in writing that we are told to issue to the media. They never stopped KPMG or instructed KPMG on 4 February to say, stop the forensic investigation into the allegations of a rogue unit. Stop the investigations into the conduct of Mr. Van Logrenberg. And sitting at that position, in this position as spokesperson at this time, I knew this was completely and patently false. That's where I'll end. After that, I left.
Sorry, so may I ask,
Please, Professor.
when you were operating as communications officer, did SARS have a media policy? Was in the code, what did it say? Who issues statements? What should be their policy in doing so?
Thank you. There was a code and there was a policy. I have it somewhere here if I need to make it available. But it basically said that the commissioner of SARS and the SARS spokesperson are the only delegated people to speak publicly on behalf of the institution, and that the commissioner may apply his or her discretion to delegate any senior executive to do particular speaking opportunities or media interviews in public.
That speaks to who issues the statements. Is there any policy on the integrity of statements, that the ethics of it, seeing you deal with vitally important taxpayer issues, issues that affect the economy? Is there no code of conduct prescribing how SARS operates on that?
Sir, to my knowledge, the code or the regulation or the provisions were never that specific. We always worked with the understanding that before any public communication goes out, it has to have the explicit approval of the commissioner or someone acting in that position in the absence of the commissioner. Where matters, taxpayer information, sacrosanct, it's confidential in terms of the SARS legislation. We can never divulge information into the public domain or to the media unless a matter is before a court of law. So that was also clearly understood. And then thirdly, any public speaking opportunity, meeting with stakeholders where the media would be in attendance, that was always cleared with the commissioner as to who goes, which senior person would go and speak, and what topic they would speak about, or what the content of that presentation or speech would be about. So in simple terms, the commissioner was the ultimate authority to sign off on such things, or a person delegating in that, or delegated to act in that position in the absence of the commissioner.
May I just ask you, Mr. Lackay, you say you were the spokesman for SARS. Was that in your job description? Is that what you were employed for?
Correct, sir. That was my title. That was what my key performance indicators were. And I was officially on my job cards, on my salary slip, my position was spokesperson for SARS.
Now, you've told us that as well, that under the policy, the commissioner could delegate that power, as it were, to other people to speak on behalf of him or of SARS.
That is correct, sir.
And you've mentioned that he had Mr. Luther
Below.
speaking on his behalf at times.
Correct, sir.
Well, what's wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with it? Was he not entitled to delegate that function to Mr. Labila?
Yes, he was.
Can you tell me as well, you said, well, after this you resigned. Just explain a bit more, why did you resign? What prompted you to resign?
I felt that my working conditions were becoming intolerable, basically because information was being kept from me on the one hand, and on the other hand, there was a very active, what I can call disinformation campaign, being driven in the media, and which manifested itself week after week from around 10 or 12 October 2014 throughout the rest of the year into 2015, where confidential internal SARS information, taxpayer information, is selectively leaked to the media, and the Sunday Times in particular. When I object to this in writing to the commissioner and say we have a problem here, it's difficult to do my work when it looks like our own colleagues are running this campaign. I raised those concerns in writing, there's no response, and no action taken. I put in writing, I warn about the reputation of the institution. I caution about the fact that employee information finds its way to this newspaper. At some point, we receive inquiries where journalists are in possession of all the investigators who work in a particular investigative unit and their ID numbers and cases they worked on, and it could put them very practically in the way of harm because they dealt with high-risk investigations. So I raised these things, there's no response. My relationship with Mr. Moyane deteriorated significantly throughout October and November, and it results in the instance I quoted from 5 December, the suspension of Pillay and Mr. Richa, where a statement is issued that would have far-reaching consequences for SARS. I know nothing about the suspensions. I haven't seen the Sikakane report. No such information is being made available to us. And yet I'm called on to respond, to go answer calls from radio stations, go on radio, do interviews about a matter which I have no information on. That's where we ended in December. By January 2015, there were threats to charge me, allegations that I peddle information to the media by Moyane, and then the instruction from Mr. Jonas Makwakwa to say other people in the form of Mr. Lubilo will now speak publicly for SARS, that I would still draft public responses on whatever issues, but it must be Luther will basically take over some of my functions. And by 19 February, in a climate of hostility and fear, which was completely strange to most of us who had worked at SARS under previous commissioners, by 19 Feb, I couldn't do my work effectively anymore. I was intimidated by the situation. Many senior people had resigned or served their notices of resignation, or others were suspended. And even when they won in court, in the case of Mr. Pillay, they were resuspended. And it was a very difficult place to work in the first quarter of 2015. A combination of those things informed my decision to resign.
You've made reference to the statement of about the 5th of December 2014 that you are uncomfortable with relating to the suspension based on the Sikakane report. Were you ever made aware that there had been a rebuttal by Mr. Pillay on the allegations that and on the report of the issues raised in the Sikakane report?
Yes, I was fully aware. And that partly informed my decision to write to Parliament on the 24th of March 2015, because we helped Mr. Pillay with the management of his documents. I was aware of the team of lawyers that helped to draft his, firstly, submission to Sikakane, and secondly, the critique after the report was given to him in November. And what I basically tried to explain to the two committees, there are these investigations, and when people make formal written submissions, and Mr. Pillay's submissions were extensive, Sikakane doesn't deal with it at all. Everything Mr. Pillay testified about today, for example, the interaction between SARS, National Intelligence, and later the State Security Agency, the minutes of meetings, correspondence between SARS, Police Crime Intelligence, correspondence between SARS, the Hawks about joint investigations. When all of the projects the unit under his authority worked on, how they were constructed, the ministerial approval that was given in 2007 for the establishment of the National Research Group. That body of evidence was put before Sikhakhane. And when reading his report, the Sikhakhane panel doesn't deal with any of that. And I try to argue to the chairpersons of the committee, I can see injustices being done here in that the people affected by these investigations are not properly being heard, and submissions they make are not properly being regarded by investigations. So yes, to answer you, I was fully aware of Mr. Pillai's submissions to Sikhakhane and his critique on the report.
But were you aware of Mr. Pillai's submission at the time of the statement being issued around his suspension based on the Sikhakhane report, or did you get to be aware of that after that statement had been issued?
I was aware before, sir.
Now, there's also one instance we've heard of here relating to, you've just dealt with Mr. Ho's resignation and the statement that was issued in relation to his resignation. There was no disciplinary action against him, as I understand. That also was the submission of SARS in your CCMA matter against SARS. Am I correct?
That is correct, sir.
Now, were you still at SARS at the time when certain leaks of information landed in the public domain suggesting that Mr. Ho was subject to disciplinary action?
Yes, I do recall one such article.
Were there any steps taken to correct that information by SARS? Any active steps to clarify that there had actually been no disciplinary action against Mr. Ho?
No, sir, not to my knowledge.
As Advocate Steinberger said, one of our terms of reference is the media issues in SARS. From your extensive experience, do you think that there's any regulatory dispensation that should be applicable to the media implications of SARS? Should the incumbent who represents them, who makes them, have to have any particular qualifications? Should there be a code of conduct regarding media issues by SARS? Is there any regulation that you think, based on all your experience, that should attach to SARS's media communications?
So it is in the SARS code for employees, as far as I can remember. I can't remember now what it says and how developed or refined it is. So that's the best I can answer to that one, sir.
Well, on that, you mentioned you had the code with you. Do you have it here in this room?
Yes, I would.
Will you give it to Ms. Steinberg before you leave?
Absolutely. It's part of my CCMA bundle of documents, so as far as I'm concerned, it's in the public domain.
And perhaps we should turn to that. A lot of this is detail of what you've already covered. I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to pick up on before I go to another topic.
I'm comfortable to proceed.
Maybe just before you could proceed, if you allow me, Advocate Steinberg, you made the submission to the chairs of the Standing Committee on Finance as well as the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence. Was there ever any response you received on that?
No formal written response, acknowledgement email to me, no. The chairperson of the Standing Committee on Finance, Mr. Yunus Karim, contacted me 2 or 3 times by telephone to convey to me that the study group of the ANC would look at the letter. That's the only reaction that I got. At some point later, I read in some of the media reports that the Finance Committee decided to refer the matter to the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence, who would deal with it, and obviously their proceedings are in camera. I had never received any communication from that committee. And then sometime later, after I've sent it to the chairs, a copy of the letter found its way out into the public domain.
So you don't know whether this letter ever served before those committees that you sent it to?
The Finance Committee, and this is in the parliamentary minutes of the Finance Committee didn't want to deal with the letter. So Dr. Dion George, who was a member of parliament for the DA at the time, obtained a copy. He wanted to table it in one of the meetings of the Standing Committee on Finance. The chairperson and perhaps some other members of the committee objected to that, and it was never dealt with or tabled. Mr. George then proceeded to publicize the letter, as far as I know, and that's how it found its way into the public domain.
And then
This-
please carry on.
With your permission. And Mr. George, would he have received it by virtue of being a member of the committee, the standing committee, or did he find it in other ways, the copy?
His version through media interviews at the time was that he received it in his pigeonhole postbox in Parliament.
Now, it was leaked into the public domain, and this takes us to our next topic. Is that caused a bit of trouble for you, didn't it?
A little bit, to put it mildly, yes.
Tell us about that.
In response to the letter being publicized and reported on by the media, the first reaction by SARS was a letter of demand from the attorneys Mashiane, Mudli, Munama. They wanted me to withdraw the letter or the submission to Parliament, and I instructed me to apologize to Mr. Tomoyane as Commissioner. It gave me a period of, I think, 7 days, and I refused. And then the sheriff ended up at my house with a summons. They were basically suing me for defamation. SARS, the institution, on the one hand, for 10 million rand, and then Mr. Moyane as the individual or the commissioner on the other hand for 2 million rand. So a combined summons was served on me for 12 million rand defamation. And that happened around May or June 2015. During that period also, Mr. Labilo would go on radio and indicate that SARS opened a criminal case against me for the leaking of confidential SARS and taxpayer information, basically contravening, I think, Section 69 of the Tax Administration Act.
And then what has been the fate of the defamation action?
We managed to, by the end of last year, struck off the 10 million part.
In other words, SARS's claim was
Correct.
struck off, presumably because you can't defame an institution. But Mr. Moyane's claim is live. Are you still facing
Correct.
that?
As far as I know, it's live, and that's a 2 million part, which I'm sure you will have to decide how to proceed now. And concerningly for me, he's part of the litigation. That, I mean, they use the same set of lawyers, which is SARS attorneys and counsel for SARS to litigate against me, as he says in the summons, in his personal capacity. I don't know if that's correct or proper in law or allowed for, but that is what happened.
The criminal charges, where are they up to?
I've never received any. The only indication of criminal charges which surprised me was on 9 June 2015, an interview Mr. Labilo did on Radio 702 with John Robbie, where he speaks about the defamation claim, and then he says to the radio station that a criminal case has also been opened against me, I think at the Hawks. I don't know, I've never received any notification from any law enforcement that that matter is live.
Sorry. Okay. I just want to understand, how has this affected your prospect of getting employment elsewhere, and how has it affected your family?
Sure, with respect, advocate. The family part, if I answer that in full, I'm sure I'll end up in tears, which I want to avoid. Because I think, like many other people who had until now appeared before you, it was traumatic and it was stressful. And I'll leave it at that, the family part. The prospects of employment for 2015, we basically felt, and when I say we, Mr. Pillay, Mr. van Lochrenberg, Mr. Yolisa Pique, with whom I had regular contact, by May 2015, we're all out of SARS, either dismissed or resigned. And we basically felt we became unemployable. I approached about 4 or 5 large corporates, financial services companies and banks, amongst others. I went through formal processes with at least 2 of them. And then in the end, the results come back to say, look, as long as this SARS cloud hangs over your head, you are perceived to be a risk to our institution and we can't employ you. And people would say, we know who you are, we know what you did the right thing, we support you, but we can't employ you. Effectively, that was the message. And 2015 was a difficult, lonely place for us. By 2016, our group managed to find some contract employment, and we were able to sustain ourselves again in a better way. But more for my colleagues than for me, I think this rogue unit shadow will forever follow them, whether it has merit or not, and I strongly argue it was concocted nonsense. But wherever they go, whenever any journalist writes about Mr. Ivan Pillay, Johan van Lochrenberg, it will be about, reference will be made to an alleged rogue unit. I think their reputations, more than mine, have been harmed. I think people still carry the scars, and hopefully someday, though, a better sense of justice will prevail for them. People like Mr. Pillay, in my view, deserve to be back in an institution like this, or any other state institution where we need help, we need capable people with his experience in leadership positions. And at the moment, that can't happen. So I've been affected, but I think other people have been affected far worse.
And the cloud that the prospective employers have raised in relation to you, does it relate to the criminal charges that were said to have been laid against you, or is it the civil suit?
The latter, sir. Ivan and I went to see, I'll keep it vague and open, a former cabinet minister. Sometime during 2015 or 16, to say, do you know of any options or people we can talk to for employment or for work? And this former cabinet minister told us, no one wants to invite problems with SARS into their backyard, and at the moment, that stigma is attached to both of you. And that is pretty much how we felt. And in my case, to come back to your question, it would be the civil litigation that received prominence in the media at that time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lackay. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Is that the end of the evidence for today? I just want to say something and I've said it a number of times and I will say it and keep saying it. We invite any submissions from the public or anyone else. None of the people who have given evidence here have been compelled to do so. All of them have been invited to do so and we've heard their evidence. We will weigh their evidence when we've heard all the evidence. Not at this stage. We will weigh it when we've heard what anyone wants to say. So if anyone wishes to make submissions, give us facts, they are invited to do so, specifically invited to do so. Thank you.
Tomorrow morning, Judge.